I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey Lurkers, it's Jamie. Welcome to episode 22 of the Lurk podcast. Today we're going to be discussing the Rosewell Mansion located in the Tidewater region of Virginia. This is the same area that Old House Woods is located. They're about 30 to 40 minutes from each other, roughly. I'm guessing because I've never driven from one location to the other. It's also not too far from where I spend quite a bit of time at my family's property, and I was lucky enough to be able to make it down to Rosewell the beginning of August and take some photos. I was also able to get some EVP in preparation for this episode, and I'll be sharing that EVP towards the end of the episode, so you have that to look forward to. There are about seven different EVPs that I took that I'll be including. One of them really freaked my son out, and hopefully it comes across clear enough for you guys to hear it so you can hear why he was a little freaked. And for those of you who follow us on social media, you may have already seen a couple photos and even a short video clip. I posted those on Facebook, and I know I posted some photos on Instagram, and we even had a little contest that was going on. Anybody could guess the location that I had taken a photo of, they got a free sticker. So congrats to Sandy who was able to get that. So thanks for listening. Thanks for being a loyal lurker. I certainly appreciate it quite a bit. And hopefully in the future we'll have a couple more of those little contests. As I mentioned, Rosewell, and it does have an E in there. It's not Roswell. My son kept calling it Roswell. That's a totally different location in New Mexico that includes aliens. We're talking about Rosewell. Rosewell Mansion is located in the Tidewater region of Virginia in Gloucester County. It's actually just outside of the town of Gloucester itself. In its heyday, it operated as a tobacco plantation. It was estimated that at one time there were as many as 100 enslaved people that worked the plantation, and then around 50 by the time of the Civil War. So as far as the history of the house, construction began on the mansion in 1725, and Man Page I is the person who began building it. Unfortunately, he died in 1730 before it was able to be completed, and he ended up bequesting life rights to the mansion to his widow named Judith Carter Page. So in 1737, Judith Carter Page receives a bequest from the estate of her father, Robert Carter, to be able to continue house construction. And in 1737, Man Page II, who is son of Man Page I, obviously, he inherits the house and he completes construction in 1738. It would actually become the largest mansion in Virginia and one of the finest homes in America at the time. In 1762, Man Page II leaves Rosewell and moves into Manfield. His oldest son, John Page, moves into Rosewell with his wife. 1771, John Page begins renovation of Rosewell. This is also the year he becomes a member of the House of Burgesses. And for those of you who aren't familiar with colonial Virginia history, the House of Burgesses was basically the legislature of the colony of Virginia. It was the elected representatives. A little tidbit about John Page, because this actually is important to one of the myths of the house. John Page attended William and Mary College with Thomas Jefferson. They were actually friends, and Thomas Jefferson visited the mansion on numerous occasions. That's factual, like we know that happened, but it's said that one of the early drafts of the Declaration of Independence was written at Rosewell. That's the part of the information that is not actually validated historically anywhere. So there's no actual real record. It was just a rumor that was always talked about. It's certainly possible. In 1808, John Page dies, and his second wife inherits the 750-acre land tract that included the house and numerous slaves, though she resided in Williamsburg after John Page's death. In 1837, Thomas Booth purchases the house and begins dismantling portions of it. He sells off the lead roof, the carved marble mantles, and the wainscoted mahogany wall panels. That just kills me. As somebody who really loves old houses, loves history, is living in an old house that's at least 140 years old and trying to renovate and keep as much of the original stuff as possible, it really breaks my heart to hear that original portions of this house were actually sold off. It just kills me. Thomas Booth sells off portions of the house. He then conveys the house to his cousin, and his cousin moves in 1850 and increases the value of the buildings. Then he sells the property in 1853 to Josiah Deans. Josiah Deans dies in 1881, and his family oversees the care of the property for 2 years. Then in 1884, that's when they stop looking after the property, they decide to subdivide the property and try to sell it off. In 1904, the daughter of Josiah Deans, named Ellen Taylor, and her husband, Judge Fielding Taylor, own 247 acres of land, and that includes the house. Then, March 23, 1916, a chimney fire starts and burns until the next day. The fire began in the southwest chimney, and the heat was so intense that it damaged the stonework on top of the chimney. The fire destroyed Rosewell. All that now remains of the mansion are the 4 chimneys, the east wall with its palladium window and carved keystone, the wine cellar, and just enough walls to give you an idea of the size of the structure. So when you visit Rosewell, or when you look at the photos that I will be posting on social media, really it's nothing but ruins at this point. There's not much left at all. There's what I mentioned that was still standing, the chimneys, enough of the walls to see the size of the structure. Down a path, there's a portion of the ice house that is still standing. At the height of everything, that the house was actually 12,500 square feet. It had 3 levels and a full basement, and it had 33 rooms and 17 fireplaces. It's pretty massive. To stand next to it, to see the 4 chimneys, it's just crazy how big this place was. On the roof there were 2 turrets, inside of which were little rooms. These turrets had windows on all 4 sides, which made excellent lookouts, and there was also a beautiful view of the York River and Carter's Creek, which the property, you can't see it now because of the growth of the trees, but it's right on the York River. It was considered the finest example of colonial architecture in America. There on the grounds is the Page Family Cemetery, and this is some information that I actually had wrong for many years. I thought that the cemetery, that the tombstones and the bodies had been relocated. However, it's only the tombstones that have been removed. The bodies are actually still buried there on the Rosewell property in the area of the cemetery. They took the large tombstones and moved them to Abington Episcopal Church in 1969 for preservation purposes, but left the actual bodies. You'll actually hear in an EVP, my son, I think, asks about having bodies moved, and that's why he's saying that, because I said, the bodies were taken out of here and everything, and that's not fact. I had my story mixed up. So Rosewell is considered one of the top 10 haunted locations in the Tidewater region of Virginia, and we're going to discuss the reasons why. Some of my research, and I've brought this book up when I did the episode about Old House Woods. That is episode 2. So if you are new to the podcast, you're just joining us for the first time, I recommend that episode. It's actually one of my favorite ones. It features information about the area of Old House Woods, including investigations that I've done, which also includes some EVPs. And there was actually a bonus episode that was done the beginning of August where I went to Old House Woods and did a quick EVP session. And I recorded a little podcast while I did that. So definitely go back and check those out. If you like ghosts and hauntings, definitely one you want to listen to. So the book that I'm going to talk about is The Ghosts of Virginia by L.B. Taylor Jr. I highly recommend these books. I will include the book in the show notes. He has several different volumes. But if you like the Virginia area or you travel to the Virginia area, there's definitely a lot of haunted locations in and around Virginia. One of the first stories that I'm going to mention sort of deals with Rosewell, but also involves a nearby plantation home called Peyton Hall. It is not standing anymore either. It was burned during the Civil War. It's nothing but a foundation that's left, and I've never been there. I've never found it, but it is on my list of things to try to find. L.B. Taylor talks about, and not just L.B. Taylor, but in the book, The National Directory of Haunted Places by Dennis Houck, also lists this story. They're slightly different, but in nearby Peyton Hall, there was a woman by the name of Letitia Dalton, and she was married to Fairfax Dalton. She was a real character, and there was one time in the middle of the 18th century that Man Page II owned the house, and his wife Anne Page was known to be quite the hostess, and she threw very lavish parties and balls and things. So the word went out that there was going to be a ball at Rosewell. It was the talk of the area for weeks ahead of the event, and some of the gossip was whether or not Letitia Dalton would even attend. 2 days prior to the date of the ball, Letitia's sister, Caro, died under mysterious circumstances. Now, in the Dennis Houck book, or a version of that book, I've seen it where Caro is actually her daughter, not her sister. So I don't really know. So apparently what happened was Letitia had told her sister to go outside to get her some grapes, and it was storming at the time. Her sister Caro goes outside, but she never comes back in the house, and they end up finding her body the next morning. There were some accounts that said that her skull had been crushed by a falling tree limb, and then others said that she'd stumbled into a pile of cut glass and severed arteries and then bled to death. But it was widely known that Letitia and Caro basically hated each other, and I kind of get from the information that I have within these stories that I've read that really it's more Letitia who doesn't like Caro than the two of them hating each other mutually. I think it was one-sided, because if you really hate your sister, are you going to go out in the middle of a storm to go pick some grapes for her? Nope, not happening. Not going to do it for anybody, to be honest, even if I like them a lot. If it's storming, they can go pick their own damn grapes. They didn't like each other, or Letitia hated her, and they were often known to have these major arguments with one another. There was some gossip going around that Letitia somehow had a hand in her sister's death. Surprisingly, even though there was just this major death in the family, Letitia shows up to the ball at Rosewell. She not only shows up, but she steals the show. Everybody is apparently at the house. They're gathered downstairs, and Letitia makes a very flamboyant entrance, is a quote from L.B. Taylor's book. And she descends a staircase in a wide-hooped gown of rose-pink satin. Her powdered hair was masked with roses and plumes of rose color in the Versailles style. She's dressed to the nines. She makes quite the entrance. Shows up late, makes an entrance. And she was said to have captivated the men, but then the women were also pretty irritated with her. But she didn't really care. She didn't really care what anybody thought, which, that's not a bad way to be unless you're kind of being a witch, which kind of is what comes across in a lot of the information that I had read. She spent most of the night ignoring her husband and flirting with another gentleman, Captain Godfrey Chandos, who was heir to a dukedom. He was an Englishman. She was being what would be described at the time as scandalous. She didn't care. She goes to the ball at Rosewell and she makes a spectacle of herself. She's very flamboyant. She's dressed to the nines. She's flirting with another man, completely ignoring her husband. And all this is just a couple days after her sister's tragic death. She should at the very least be pretending to be mourning. So there was more information that she often made her husband Fairfax's life pretty miserable. He would leave the house in frustration because she would just yell at him and they would fight. And he spent much of his time with his good friends, the Pages at Rosewell. So she would be a witch at home, pretty nasty, and he would leave and he'd go visit the Page family. Her sister dies. It's being talked about. It's being whispered that she may have had something to do with it. Around that time, there was another tragedy that struck Peyton Hall, which, as I said, is the neighbor to Rosewell. Fairfax Dalton had gone to bed, and it was reported that he had heard a voice calling him from the bottom of the stairs, saying, "Fairfax, here! Fairfax, I am here." And it was a very faint noise. He thought it sounded fearful and urgent, and he went to the top of the staircase and peered down into the darkness, and he heard, "Here I am, look over here." And as he leaned hard on the railing, it gave way, and he fell headfirst down 2 stories into the marble floor, and he died of a broken neck. There were no witnesses, and Letitia claimed to have been asleep in her own room, but the opinion was that she was the one who had called him to his death. She was labeled a murderer, but ironically, she was never charged or taken to trial or anything. That was just more public opinion. She ended up dying of natural causes in her bed. It said that years afterward, guests at Peyton Hall told of seeing a small shadowy figure of a woman passing through darkened halls, and as she went by, they felt a sudden push or a tripping of their feet. One lady saved herself from hurling down the stairs by grasping the newel post. Others reported hearing horrible cries ring through the house late at night, and there were often stories of blood on the marble floor that was impossible to clean. In 1840, it was reported that slaves refused to stay in the huts near the old stud cabin, saying they had seen a Negro woman crouched on the floor of the cabin, wailing over a young girl who was covered with blood. The superintendent told of hearing sobs of terrible anguish coming from the cabin late at night. There was actually a story that surfaced regarding the death of Caro, who was Letitia's sister. Apparently, it said that Letitia had gone out and had placed shards of glass in a spot where the grapes hung in clusters. She apparently loosened a board or something and created a situation where when her sister went to pick the grapes, she would lean on this loosened board and it would cause all the glass shards to fall down on her. And then of course, there was the storm when she sent her out there, and that the wind caused even more of a problem. There's also a story that says that one of the slave women, actually similar to this story, that she was crying over the body of Caro and that she actually poisoned Letitia, but this account says that Letitia died of natural causes, so I'm not sure which one it is. Eventually, as I said, Peyton Hall burned to the ground during the Civil War. It was during the Battle of York Plains Ford. There's nothing remaining other than the foundation, but some people say they can hear voices and screaming and cries of anguish. So that's close to Rosewell, and it ties in with Rosewell because she was known to go there for the balls and the parties. Her husband was known to be friends with the pages and would go there to get away from his evil wife, who was nothing but a witch. And by witch, I don't mean a witch, I mean a other word witch. I'm sure you figured that out. There are several different stories that go along with Rosewell. Most of them have to do with the balls and the parties that were thrown there. Some people claim to have seen young servant boys standing beside the doorway at night, holding lanterns, lighting the way for the guests that are coming to the balls, or holding open doors that aren't there anymore. So while they see the boys standing there, eventually they end up vanishing right there before their eyes. Often people have heard violin music, and they've also heard harpsichord music playing, as if the ball is currently going on the floor that no longer exists. There was a story of an office worker from Williamsburg who was a native of Matthews County. And like I said, Matthews County is the neighboring county where Old House Woods is located. He had 2 experiences at Rosewell. One time, he and his friend were exploring the ruins at night, and they stumbled onto what may have been the entrance to the wine cellar. And the gentleman's friend lit a match to see better, and when he lit the match, there was a brick that was flung at him that knocked the match out of his hand. He never went back to Rosewell, not even in the daylight. And the gentleman from Williamsburg said, "I have to admit, it scared the hell out of us. We had always heard a slave had been buried in the walls." And that was something that I had come across too, and some of the legends was that there was a slave that was buried in the walls of the plantation. I don't know how truthful that is either. I would imagine that after the fire and some of the archaeological work that's gone on, they probably would have found some evidence of that, and I haven't heard of any evidence of that being found as of today. On the second occasion, this gentleman went with a different friend and 2 girls, and they were walking through the old cemetery at night. They saw what they appeared to be a light coming from the house. Not wanting to scare the girls, they ended up walking back to the site alone to investigate. The two gentlemen walked back to the site, and they said, as we reached the perimeter of the ruins, we both were overcome by the most all-powerful stench I have ever smelled. It was potent. I have never smelled anything like it in my life. It literally drove us away. So these individuals, the first time this gentleman goes, his friend lights a match to be able to look down into the wine cellar, and a brick is thrown at him and knocks the match out of their hand. And then the second time, the gentleman goes with another male friend and two girls, and they're walking around the property, walking through the cemetery there, and they see a light, and the two gentlemen go to investigate, and when they get closer to the ruins, they are just overcome with this awful smell. There was another experience by a different gentleman. He and his sister and some of their friends often would go investigating the paranormal as kind of a hobby, so basically pretty much what I do on occasion. They wanted to check out the ghost stories, see what was going on, and they had a camera and a tape recorder and some other equipment, and they decided to go to the ruins, and they drove down to the edge of the cornfield near the entrance road and got out there because the road is chained. Now, this is quite a bit ago. You cannot go back there without being seen. They have surveillance cameras around. They've had a lot of problems with vandalism, and they don't want anything to happen to what's left of the property, to the ruins, so you cannot go back there at night. Don't even try it. So this group went, and they had two dogs with them, but the dogs immediately, when they went to go on the property, the dogs began howling and refused to move. And they said that they tried to pull them, but they couldn't get them to move an inch. And it was something that the dogs had never done before. So they tied the dogs to a tree, and they continued to walk down the entrance road. And as they were walking down the road, they swore that they were hearing the sound of drumming coming from the area of the ruins. But when they got there, there was nothing there. And they said they retraced their steps back to the car, and everyone got in the car. And just as they did, the dogs began barking furiously at the back window. And everybody said the hair on the back of their neck stood up. When they looked out the window, there a few yards away, they saw a black man suspended 4 or 5 feet above the ground. One of the women began screaming hysterically, and they drove off, spinning their tires in the dirt. They had the distinct feeling the man, or whatever it was following them, so they sped so fast on the rough surface, their heads bumped against the roof of the car. I can remember doing something similar to this with Kelly and my aunt and my kids, and I'm sure when she listens, she'll chuckle because it was the same terrified flight out of Old House Woods. They get a mile or so down the road, and they stop. They get out. They look back, there's no evidence of the man at all. He's gone. There was a small tree, only about 1 inch in diameter at the side of the road, that leaned out over the little road there, and without warning, the tree began shaking violently, but they couldn't see any reason for it. There was no wind, and there was nothing there causing it to happen. So they jump in the car again and speed off. This time they didn't stop until they got back to town and parked underneath a street lamp. And they got out and walked around the car, and it was covered in dew. And one of the group called the others over to the rear of the car, and in the dew they could see impressions of a baby's hand and a man's hand with a missing index finger. There's also an instance of a gentleman by the name of Raymond who worked at a fiber plant in James City County. He and a buddy with a couple ladies were out just riding around, and they decided to go visit Rosewell Ruins. I would imagine a couple decades ago it was probably kind of like a lover's lane sort of place to go. It's really secluded in the middle of nowhere. It's not very easy to find, and when you're driving back to it, you're not really sure if you're even going the right way. Now there are a few extra signs than what used to be there, and like I said, you can't really go back there because of the surveillance cameras. You can't go back there when it's not open, I should say. So the Raymond and his friends, they're driving down the lane heading down to the ruins, and as they turn back to go to the house, there's this old black car with a 1930s era license plate, and it's blocking the driveway. And it said that it had one half-moon window in the back, and it was facing away from them. And they were kind of startled, and they hit the brakes, and you could see the car clear in the headlight beams. It was just parked right there blocking the road. And as they sat there in silence, they saw the head of a woman rise up in the rear window, and she stared at them. It said that she had raven black hair and a pale white face, and they panicked and tried to get the car in reverse, but the gears kept sticking. And all that time, the woman kept looking at them and was looking at them unblinkingly. Finally, they get the car in gear and they take off out of there. They pulled back a few hundred yards and then they stopped. And then they decided they wanted to wait until daylight to check things out, and there was no other way out of there. There were no other roads or paths or anything, and if the car left, it had to go past them. At daybreak, they drove back down the driveway to the spot where they had seen the car, and there was nothing there. The car and the woman had disappeared. There were no tracks or anything. They looked everywhere. They couldn't find anything. There's another story regarding that there's a couple that went to go to Rosewell, and they parked there, and when they came back to their vehicle, they found that their car was blocked by a vehicle with 1930s plates. They got out of their car and they saw that there was a pale woman peering at them through the back window. They knocked on the window, but no one rolled the window down, and they peered in, but there was no one actually in the car. So this is a different account, same type of car or same type of license plate, same woman, little bit different circumstances. They also say that there is a woman in a red cloak that is seen rushing from the house into the area of what was the rose garden. And many people also hear the sounds of the slaves returning from the fields. And not only have they heard the slaves returning from the fields, but some people have actually seen them walking the grounds. Others have claimed that the ghost of Thomas Jefferson himself has been seen there on the property. There was another account that took place in the late 1970s where a gentleman and his two friends drove to Rosewell one night to check it out. And he says that they were about 16 to 17 years old and were interested in the ghost stories. So his friend, who went by the name of Dallas, parks his truck in front of the mansion. It's about 100 feet or so from the front steps. It was dark, there was no moon, totally pitch black. They turn off the truck engine, they turn off the lights, and as their eyes adjust to the darkness, they notice two red lights slowly coming in view in front of them. And as they continue to watch, the lights appear to look like taillights of a car parked in front of them. They couldn't be sure, though. And the gentleman and his other friend Tommy were discussing the possibility of it being a car, while Dallas said nothing. As we watched the two lights, the gentleman says, Tommy and I became convinced that it had to be a car, and someone else was parked there, but then the lights started levitating and moving around. Tommy and I were astonished and started asking each other if we were both seeing the same thing. We asked Dallas if he was also seeing what we were seeing, but he remained silent. Tommy and I wondered if somebody was messing with us, but how could the lights float as high as tree limbs? Was it possibly a boat on the York River? After all, the river was behind the Rosewell plantation. But we decided that the river was too far away from the mansion, and besides, the vegetation and forest would obscure the view. They watched in fascination. More lights started to appear and dart around in the tree limbs and in front of the mansion stairs. And as they were watching in fascination of the lights show, all of a sudden, their friend Dallas starts the truck, throws it in reverse, plows through the cornfield, and they're bouncing around in the cab of the truck while the truck tears through the corn rows. And then they took off and left. And the gentleman said that he and his friend Tommy, it was 50 years later, and they still discussed the night from time to time, but their friend Dallas refused to ever speak about it. He claims he saw nothing. But, they know better. They speculated that because of Dallas's upbringing, that he was probably taught not to mess around with spirits, and that's why he refuses to admit what they actually saw that night. There's also stories of a young woman who is seen walking down the front steps every night, only to vanish. And there's lots of accounts of different, of strange noises that people hear. People, like I said, here have heard violin music. They've heard harpsichord music. They've heard the sounds of the slaves coming in from the fields. They've also heard horses' hoofbeats, like horses or somebody's riding a horse around. Others have heard noises coming from the basement area, but when they looked in that area, they never found anything. And actually, as far as horses go, like many people have heard the sound of horses trotting down the driveway. Others have heard the sound of horses kind of churning, as the word is, like walking on the gravel. But there were never any horses there. while we were there at the beginning of this month, I actually smelled horses. There's no real close farms right there within that area, and horses have a distinct smell. If you've ever ridden or have owned horses, and I used to ride quite a bit, and we have a horse, horses have a distinct smell. It was like there was a horse right nearby, but there was nothing. In the area of the ruins, there's a field, kind of like a pasture, and that's where you park. There's no trees in that area. And then there's a few trees, a few sparse trees, and then there's the open area where the ruins are. So you can see the area around you. And then there's cornfields. So there's really no place for a horse to be. We never heard one. I smelled it briefly and smelled it for like a minute or two, and then it was gone. Then there was another group of people who claimed to be amateur paranormal investigators. There were 4 of them, 2 guys and 2 girls. They all had their own flashlights, and when the guys went into the cellar and the girls walked in after them, all their flashlights dimmed. One of the guys freaked out, saying he saw someone standing on each side of them. The witness admitted that it felt as if they were being escorted. That particular person decided to never go back to the ruins again. It was also mentioned that if you go over by the ice house and look at the mansion, it looks like there's a man sitting on one of the ledges. People have gone there and taken photos, and they've gotten photos of orbs, which orbs aren't the best evidence of the paranormal. I've kind of touched upon it, I think, once. Orbs can be explained by so many different things. Moisture, rain, snow, any kind of precipitation, dust, pollen, anything in the air will reflect the flash on a camera and show up as an orb. So because of that, most orb photos are discounted because it's too easy to create the photo using something else. So as I've mentioned before, the only way to prove the paranormal is by disproving everything else, and even then you're just left with well, it might be this, because there's no actual science yet behind any of this. EVPs are, in my opinion, some of the best evidence that you can get. And when we went there this last time, we took some EVP recordings. And I was there with my mom and my son, Ethan, who is 15. This was like my 3rd or 4th visit to Rosewell. And they have like a little mini museum. It has a little gift shop, and they have some displays with a lot of photos. They've been able to gather some photos of the inside of Rosewell prior to it burning down. And that was a new feature of what they have. And that was actually pretty fascinating to see some of the inside of the building. It was a huge home. I mean, even the ruins don't do it justice. It was a massive home, 12,500 square feet. We leave the little museum and we drive down the lane to where the ruins are located. One of the first EVPs were asking if there's anyone here. We asked, what's your name? Did you live in the mansion? And we got some EVP with that. So I'm going to play that for you here.
What is your name? You live in the mansion at some point.
So you can't really hear me. I'm running one recorder. My son is running the other. We have 2 recorders going, and I ask in the background, is there anybody here? And there was a response. Then you can hear him ask, what is your name? Did you live in the mansion at some point? You can't really understand what's being said, but you can certainly hear. So I'm going to play it one more time for you.
What is your name? You live in the mansion at some point.
Now I'm going to play this next EVP.
This is Jamie at Rosewell. Is there anybody here? Is there anyone here with us? Did you fight in any wars? Did you fight in the Civil War? Did you help those? Is there anything you want to say? Good job.
You can hear me asking if there was anybody here, and it actually sounds almost like somebody says, help me. Then you hear my son ask about, have you fought in any wars? Did you fight in the Civil War? And we get responses to that, but nothing that you can understand. So I'm going to play it one more time, but pay attention there to see if you can hear the help me in there too.
This is Jamie at Rosewell. Is there anybody here? Is there anyone here with us? Did you fight in any wars? Did you fight in the Civil War? Did you help those? Is there anything you want to say? the chopper.
So we have another EVP here. I'm going to play that for you now.
Is there anyone here with us? What's your name? Did you live on the first floor of this mansion? Or did you live higher up? Did you live on the slave quarters? Were you in a war? Did you go to school?
So in that particular EVP, in the very beginning, it sounds like somebody says, "Help me, boy," but not in a like pleading help me way, like somebody's telling somebody to help them do the work. It sounds like it's saying, "Help me, boy." And then you hear Ethan ask some questions. After he asks the question, "Did you live in the slave quarters?" There's some whispering, and you can almost make out the words that are being said, but the only word that I actually could get was the word "forgot." It sounds like the word "forgot" is in there. So let me play that one for you one more time.
Is there anyone here with us? What's your name? Did you live on the first floor of this mansion? Or did you live higher up? Did you live on the slave quarters? Were you in a war? Did you go to school?
Then we have another EVP, and we are in the area of the cemetery this time. And like I had mentioned before, Ethan says something about asking about their bodies being moved, and their bodies weren't moved, which I learned after the fact. So here is this recording.
Is there anyone here with us? Was your body moved to a different location? Did you help build this mansion? Were you in a civil war? Were you ever a runaway slave? Are you mad that your body was moved? Did you live in this mansion? What wars did you fight in?
In that particular EVP, again, there really wasn't anything that you could understand 100%, but in listening to it when I was editing the EVPs, there's actually quite a bit of talking that's going on, but you can't quite make out exactly what it says. And I encourage you to listen to these if you have earbuds. A lot of times, like the noise canceling earbuds allow you to really focus on the EVP itself. So while if you're listening in the car or on your phone, something like that, you may not be able to make out everything that I'm pointing out here to you. But if you listen with earbuds, you may be able to pick up on that a little bit clearer. But let me play this one for you one more time.
Is there anyone here with us? Was your body moved to a different location? Did you help build this mansion? Were you in a civil war? Were you ever a runaway slave? Are you mad that your body was moved? Did you live in this mansion? What wars did you fight in? So
the next EVP, I I say, I'm thanking them for talking to us, and I'm asking for, and there's a response, and then I say you have one last chance to say something, and there's a response there. So let me play that for you. And just so you know, in putting this on the computer, it did not pick up my voice very well. I think this may have actually been recorded on the recorder that Ethan was holding, and that I was actually standing away from him, which is why you can't really hear me very well. So let me go ahead and play that. So this is the one that freaked out Ethan, and it freaked him out because if you listen to the very end of that, when I am in the distance saying you have one last chance, if there's something you want to say, it responds with Ethan. So let me play that for you again. Then we have one more EVP, pretty much along the same lines as all the other ones, asking if anyone's here, if they lived here, if they helped build the house. So let me go ahead and play that for you.
Is anyone here with us? Did you used to live here at one point? Did you help build this mansion?
So like I said, pretty much the same as all the other ones that we've heard. I will go ahead and play it one more time.
Is anyone here with us? Did you used to live here at one point? Did you help build this mansion?
All right. Well, I think this is pretty much going to do it for this episode. I always wanted to discuss the Rosewell Mansion. It's one of those areas that I am really drawn to. I've always been fascinated with the colonial history of Virginia and the Civil War history of Virginia, really just Virginia in general. Good majority of my family comes from Virginia. The plantation, I just could always envision what it looked like when it was not burnt down and it was still a house, and it must have been an absolutely magnificent structure. And I also want to touch upon a couple of the stories regarding Letitia and Fairfax Dalton and Caro. I did a little bit of quick research trying to pull out some information on them, and I have been unable to actually find any information on Peyton Hall, who owned it, or the Daltons. That doesn't mean that they absolutely didn't exist. It just means that it would require a little bit more involved research than the cursory research that I did. Sometimes when you're doing genealogy research, which is basically what I attempted to do here, you have to go beyond just doing a quick search on the internet or doing a search in Ancestry. I don't really have anything super specific to go on. The names that I have may not be 100% correct. They may not be spelled the same way, but I was unable to find them in anything. So I'm not saying that they don't exist. I'm just saying that that particular story, I don't have anything to back it up with, but it makes for one heck of a story. And I know that the Peyton Hall is not located, it's not Rosewell, but it is nearby. And she did visit Rosewell. So a murderer, because it seems like that's what she was, visited Rosewell Plantation. If you ever have a chance to go there, I encourage you to go and visit if you're in the area. There's a small fee to go in there, and that helps with all the archaeological research that they're doing. They are trying to preserve the plantation and keep it going for generations to come so that everybody can come and see what's left of what was one of the grandest homes in the Tidewater region of Virginia. I will also include links to the Rosewell Foundation for further information. If you want to become a member, give a donation to help out with the renovations. So that's going to do it for this episode of Lurk and the stories regarding Rosewell Mansion. I believe they are planning on possibly having some ghost tours this year. They've had them in the past. COVID's caused some problems with having them, so I'm not sure 100% if they're going to be able to schedule them or not. If they are, I am hoping to be able to head down that way, and perhaps that'll be another bonus episode. So as always, you can find Lurk on your favorite podcast platform. We're on all of them. And you can also find us on lurkpodcast.com. There we have links to each of the episodes. There are links to the directories, the podcast directories that we're listed in. There are links to our social media pages. We are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. I highly recommend liking or following us on one or more of those particular social media platforms. I try to do updates, put photos that go along with our episodes, any event information, anything, any places we may be popping up. And we also have a new Facebook group that you can find by going on the page. It's also listed in the show notes of episodes. And I encourage you to join that because we're trying to get a lot of discussion going there. And of course, we have t-shirts and hoodies and various things on our merchandise page. That's lurkpodcastmerch.com. And merch is spelled MERCH. So I encourage you to go grab something there. We get a very small fee back from that, and that helps us with the podcast production. So that's going to do it for today. And as always, keep lurking.
Yeah.